is a recent ORF publication by my colleague Shravishta Jayakumar. She's looking at ethical and regulatory considerations in the collection and use of biometric data. Regulatory and ethical dimensions of biometric data collection and use are important issues, but I think these are issues that have not received sufficient traction in the policy circles, at least outside of the government in a sense. And I think that's why we decided to do this fellow seminar on this when Shravishta got out this publication a couple of months ago. In India, the biometric data usage has expanded from financial to healthcare and governance issues. Biometric data is information that deals with the unique physiological as well as behavioral features of an entity used for identification or authentication purposes. In the legal parlance, the Information Technology IT Rules 2011 defines biometrics as biometrics means the technologies that measure and analyze human body characteristics such as fingerprints, eye retinas, irises, voice patterns, facial patterns, hand measurements, and of course DNA for authentication purposes. The biometric data, as per the Personal Data Protection Bill, it says facial images, fingerprints, iris scans, or any other similar personal data resulting from measurements or technical processing operations carried out on physical, physiological, or behavioral characteristics of a data constitute the biometric data in a sense. With the kind of fast-paced changes that we see in the usage of biometric technologies and biometric data use, the need for strong legal measures to protect the privacy and data of the citizens cannot be emphasized enough. This issue received a number of headlines, of course, in the context of Aadhaar a few years ago. Following the large-scale use of Aadhaar, the debates within the country began to talk about the underlining the need for strong legal measures and legal architecture in order to ensure that the data is not misused and so on and so forth. There are, of course, other rules as well and regulations that guide the biometric data use in India, like the Digital Personal Data Protection Act 2023, which seeks to bring about some balance between the need for technological progress on the one hand, but on the other side, you need to also the protection of individual privacy and security. There are, in addition, the Aadhaar Act and the Information Act 2000, which are also significant legislation related to the use of biometric data. But do all stakeholders understand and comply with these rules and regulations? There are still unresolved issues that need to be addressed in how the data is collected and how they are used. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing this seminar for today for sure. Because in India, biometric systems are in place and executed not just by the government agencies for various services-related issues, but also in terms of it's also spread across multiple business sectors, banking, healthcare, law enforcement, and so on and so forth. So this is an important issue that has not received adequate attention from the policy community, in the think tank community, but it's also very individual issue in a sense. So how are we dealing with these issues? To discuss all of this, we have a terrific panel, starting with my colleague Shravishta, who has authored this report, who will be followed with by two expert panelists, Debayan Gupta, who is an assistant professor of computer science at Ashoka University, and second, Meghna Bal, director, SIA Center, who's also joined us here in person. Without further ado, let me give the floor to Shravishta. You have about 25 minutes or so. Yeah. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. While my presentation is being pulled up on screen, I'll just give you an introduction of my paper that Raji has already given a very comprehensive overview of what I'm going to be discussing. The primary purpose of this paper is to discuss biometric data in its two major forms, that is first generation or physical biometric data and second generation or dynamic and behavioral biometric data. The use of this data not only in domestic situations but also in national security, and why there is an imperative need for ethical considerations because of its use in national security. Like I said, biometric data comes in two forms, physical and behavioral, where physical or first generation biometric data can include fingerprints, retinal scans, and any static physical attributes. These usually are used in forms of crime control, identification, ranging from your phones to your airports to banks. The more interesting form of data is second generation biometric data or behavioral biometric data. data. This is also called dynamic biometric data because it is data collected from an individual in dynamic socio-spatial environments. So this can be how your eye dilates due to hormone responses, how you move across a keypad, how your mouse patterns move based on a video game, or even how you respond to stressors in crowded spaces, in airports, in travel hubs, and many other situations. So it can also include body language. Biometric identifiers have been used in traditional means such as RFID tags and passports, but now with AI and Web 3.0, there are increasing concerns on how algorithmic biases can use biometric data and enhance or exacerbate negative biases. There's already a large amount of information that's collected by various data fiduciaries, including the government. And this data has the potential of becoming a powerful political tool in DNA databases, law enforcement, even access and authentication in terms of rations or access to public spaces and public welfare, and how this can be misused by people who can exploit vulnerabilities and data breaches. Biometric data has evolved significantly since Alec Jeffreys developed genetic fingerprinting in the 1980s. This was used primarily for crime detection and authentication, but now has also contributed to modern forms of biotechnology such as CRISPR. Countries like China lead in government-held DNA databases, housing 68 million samples of individual DNA samples as of 2020. This is followed by US with 17 million samples, the UK with 6 million samples. And these databases are completely beat by private sector DNA databases such as Ancestry DNA, which claims to hold 23 million individual DNA samples as of 2019. And obviously, with more use, the number of DNA samples increase. Biometric verification enhances identity authentication and public sector access, such as finance services, law enforcement. It also bolsters control through technologies such as password, identity cards, and they're omnipresent from your smartwatches and phones to national security applications and drones and satellite surveillance. And obviously have many other benefits. But despite their benefits, biometric data has many significant ethical concerns, as listed on the screen. One of the major concerns is participation gaps. This talks about registration in biometric information, which can have challenges due to physical disabilities, medical conditions, or even cultural and religious beliefs that may stop a person from participating. One of the major criticisms of the Aadhaar system, for example, is a participation gap, which doesn't accommodate for individuals who may have injuries or disabilities ranging from damaged irises to maybe missing fingers and not being able to submit all 10 fingerprints. Then there's false authentication. Incomplete or incorrect records in biometric databases can lead to false matches. While this is not a concern for individual phone users, in crime detection and in law enforcement, this becomes a problem for facial recognition and especially DNA mapping, where family members or people with similar face structures can get attributed to outcomes that they have not participated in simply by either having similar face structures or having been in the same crime scene before. The next is spoofing. Spoofing is biometric systems that can be exploited through vulnerabilities and lead to identity theft. The intentional misuse of this data is also called function creep and is an invasion of privacy. One of the major cases of this was when a significant member of the EU financial sector was exploited with deepfake use, where his voice was used to extract significant amounts of their banking information and also a lot of money from their bank. And this has been reported by the FBI. It became an international case. There's also covert collection of data where an individual may consent to submitting certain amounts of data but might not consent to how that data is used. One of the cases of this was when children's DNA samples were being collected by a hospital in the UK, and they were without permission of the guardians using the same information for larger studies. And this obviously is a violation of the privacy of not just the children but also the parents, because you can detect ethnicity, lineage, and much more information through DNA samples. Then there is non-consensual collection of data. This is biometric data that doesn't consider transactional consent. Most people are relatively okay with submitting data as long as there is some transactional cost, whether it is more accurate ads or access to certain welfare. But when it comes to secondary biometric data, the concept of transactional consent is also taken away, because you don't know when you're being recorded in an airport. You don't know when your face is being mapped by your laptop. Some technologies can use facial recognition, including heat mapping to drones, and gray zone warfare is another concern in non-consensual data. Biometric data and national security is another space that I was just referring to. The use of fingerprinting, as we all know, began in the early 19th century, when fingerprints were used to identify different prisoners and different people who could be convicted of crimes. This then became even more important post 9/11, when biometrics, and especially financial data associated to biometrics, became fundamental in identifying individuals, not just in law enforcement, but also in immigration. Biometrics are used globally. There are 118 countries that currently use biometrics as fundamental as fingerprinting in counterterrorism. The United Nations Security Council also has a resolution 2396 that encourages biometric database development and sharing the same amongst other organizations that oversee biometric data, such as Interpol. There's also the potential for biometric citizenship, which talks about linking biomedical data to access for welfare, but has the potential of being exploited in racial discrimination. One example of this is what we saw during the COVID-19 era, where there was extreme discrimination and marginalizing of Southeast Asian immigrants in the US. Another is when you're applying for a visa, the medical checks that people from Southeast Asia or Africa are required to go through are very different from people who originate from the global north, and that comes under biometric scanning. There's also the integration of biometrics with modern technology that can possibly target civilians. This can range from, as I mentioned before, unmanned aircrafts and CCTV, and how these technologies are also dual use, as all technology is. So something like unmanned aircrafts, which use biometric heat mapping to identify people who are in need of vaccines, can also be used for biometric heat mapping for targeting people in warfare zones. There's also integration of AI. As we all know, AI has its biases, which still need to be worked upon. And with biometric data, and especially biometric data that lacks ethical considerations, it augments the risk of racial biases and other inherent biases that can potentially lead to not just biases in private sector outcomes, but also unjust surveillance of civil society, activists, and descendants in general. There are also other human right concerns, such as ethical applications, the freedom of expression, the freedom of movement. And one of the biggest examples that will constantly come up in this paper is the issue with the Aadhaar card. As mentioned before, there are issues with inclusion in the Aadhaar card when it comes to disability. Another major issue is in sects of society. So, for example, elderly people who may not have the same documentation, or may not have the same facial structure as they did 5 years ago. If you're using previously existing biometric data, that would be an issue that will come up with your Aadhaar card. Another is transsexual individuals who may not have the right documentation for their identity. That is another issue that might come up with your Aadhaar card. And therefore, biometrics need ethical considerations as simple as constantly updating your databases and disregarding old data. Then there's also the use of biometrics in civic and private spaces. This is as common as using voter IDs, national IDs, and in private spaces like your laptops. The reason this becomes a concern is because we tend to consent to biometric data collection without knowing we're consenting to biometric data collection. One of the cases over here was a class action lawsuit that was in the US against Facebook, where they were collecting facial recognition data without overtly asking for consent from their users and using it to train their AI. And it was a it was a case that was settled out of court, but the concern is that it happened to begin with. And to control for this to happen in India and any other nation, we need to make sure that our regulations also consider open consent and ethics around the same. One of the major parts of this paper, as I mentioned earlier, is behavioral biometric data. This includes digital fingerprinting, keystroke dynamics, social interactions. It can also be collected without obstruction, which raises privacy concerns, as I mentioned earlier. Two very interesting cases of this in national security are the US's FAST project and the EU's ADAPS project. FAST is future attribution or screening technology, and ADAPS is automatic detection of abnormal behavior and threats in crowded spaces. Both of these projects function very similarly in different regions. They talk about governing and surveilling individual behavior in public spaces that may be considered threatening. However, neither of them have ethical considerations that talk about many variables that can influence a person's behavior that may make it seem threatening, ranging from individual stressors to cultural differences to possibly even the mental condition that might bother a person when they are under surveillance. The ethical considerations are many in these projects and in private sector use. There is the ethics of biometric technologies overall. They are very reliable. There is near 99.9% reliability when it comes to use of biometrics, especially static biometrics. But that itself leads to large populations of false identification. That range means that in a population of 10,000, you already have 10 disadvantaged individuals. So in national security, border control, and crime reduction, where individual dignity is of importance and time management is also of importance, 10 individuals incorrectly blamed is a very, very high number. There's also applications in security and health, as I mentioned with health detection and heat mapping earlier. There's challenges of anonymization, which talks about DNA mapping, which cannot ever be completely anonymized without external ethical considerations. So non-anonymizing can perpetuate AI biases, and that is something that we need to consider. There's human rights and privacy concerns. The UN Commission on Human Rights already stresses on data regulation and metadata monitoring, but this is just a recommendation and a stress in one of their documents. It is not implemented across different nations. Private sector accountability is also an ethical concern. While private sector organizations do collect a lot of biometric data, there aren't usually government standards that hold all of them accountable. Plus, the different sizes of private sector organizations also impacts how they collect data and how much they can be held accountable, which needs to be considered. There are also consent issues. Like I mentioned before, first generation biometrics are usually consented to when submitted. Second generation biometrics, however, it is more difficult to ask for explicit consent every single time. And therefore, awareness is an ethical issue that we do need to consider here. Behavioral attributes and analysis. As I mentioned, second generation biometrics talks about behavioral traits, and it is very important to create standards on collection and standards on analysis over here that talk about individual attribution, individual cultures, individual mental health, and many other individual factors that need to be considered to avoid the risk of misinterpretation. The regulatory landscape of biometric data globally is not very well formed, considering this future scope of technology. Considering static biometrics, most countries do have well-formed regulations. So globally, you have Article 12 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and 17 on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that talk about privacy, but they don't directly talk about biometric data. In India, as Dr. Raji had mentioned earlier, there is the Information Technology Act that discusses biometric data. There is also the Aadhaar Act, and recently we also had the DPDPA. But most of these acts don't discuss biometric data as a sensitive personal data. They've merged the terms, and they, more importantly, do not discuss secondary biometric data at all. Similarly, in the European Union, the EU Act discusses biometric data and identification, but secondary biometric data, other than voice recognition, is completely ignored. The United States, surprisingly, only has 3 states which have comprehensive biometric privacy laws, out of which Illinois has a Biometric Information Privacy Act that does talk about facial recognition data and voice mapping, but second generation biometrics that can be judged in socio-spatial environments is completely ignored. Australia is one country which has very well-formed biometric regulations. They have a Privacy and Data Protection Act in 2014, which includes information privacy and talks about biometric data's collection and privacy implications. The Office of Victorian Information Commissioner also oversees biometric data, including static and behavioral. And they talk about keystrokes, mouse movements, and many other forms of behavioral biometric data. The only consideration over here that they can expand into is considering socio-spatial biometric data, so that projects like US's FAST and EU's ADAPTs are also covered under such regulations. Japan is infamous for using facial recognition technology in civil spaces. However, they don't use live facial recognition. They do have acts on protection of personal information, and this does include biometric data, but it also mostly talks about how biometric data cannot be anonymized. There aren't a lot of public safeguards in this act. South Africa also has a Protection of Personal Information Act. While South Africa has an act that covers biometric data, including physical and psychological and behavioral, it's mostly because of a lack of definitions that the act tends to cover all of the spaces. It still requires explicit definitions in all of these areas. Brazil also has the LGBT, which covers anonymized and sensitive data, including biometric data, sensitive personal data, but it doesn't cover behavioral biometric data, much like most of the other acts. In my regulatory recommendations, I have mostly targeted these recommendations to what could possibly be a national oversight committee. While there are already organizations like the UN that recommend standards, the Interpol that talks about standards at national security levels, and the ISO that talks about standards at private sector levels, different nations need to have individual authorities that can oversee biometric data, and specifically behavioral biometric data. The first of these recommendations would be to have explicit definitions and subtypes of biometric data. We've already spoken about primary and secondary biometric data. Another definition that's very important is to have bioinformatics, which is the data that is derived from primary and secondary biometric data to analyze and come up with results and processing based on the same. The second is to have standardized privacy-preserving biometric schemes. These are a little more technical. They tend to be forms of coding where databases are protected and can range from biometric encryption, which is a verification method based on keys, cancelable biometric data, or two-step verifications, or a combination of all, which is called homomorphic encryption. Something like this is extremely important, not just to standardize at a government level, but also to ensure is implemented at a private sector level. As I mentioned earlier, the International Standards Organization already has standards that are set under the ISO JTC SC 37. This has a set standard for biometric data storage, protection against false authentication attacks, and verification, but also does not discuss behavioral biometric data. One of the recommendations here would be to ensure that these standards are a requirement for private sectors within the country and not simply an additional bonus for a private sector to recommend their services. There's also the usage of clearance and checkpoints. There should always be human level involvement at multiple checkpoints to ensure that automated system error rates are minimized and to ensure that AI biases are also minimized. It's important to include purpose limitation and repurposing barriers in data protection as well, especially in biometric data. There's also statute of limitations on collection. Biometric data should ideally be destroyed after a predetermined period of time. One example of this is the UK's National Health Society, which destroys DNA data after 5 years. There's also different grades of protection based on the definitions and the purpose of the biometric data that is collected. There should be different levels of protection. For example, there should be more individual autonomy and purpose limitation for data that's collected by the private sector. For national security reasons, maybe the lifeline of the data can be extended, but it should still be regularly updated, and individuals should still have autonomy in the same. All of this is only possible if there are legal guarantees and authorized governing bodies. This means that there needs to be a national governing authority to oversee biometric data specifically under data privacy. They need to mandate informed consent in collecting, using, and storing biometric data, implementing compliance measures and regular audits for private sector organizations. These regulations also need to be extended to facial recognition technology immediately, because these are realities of today, and also socio-spatial biometrics, which are upcoming very soon in domestic use as well. And all of these need legal guarantees, not just legal recommendations. To conclude, biometric data is a very prominent part of data collection. It is something that should be considered by multiple regulations. And as technology is advancing, biometric data is no longer static. It is very dynamic, and we do need to consider more forms of data collection, simply more than simply fingerprints and retina scans. For this, we need to preempt technological advancements and adapt these into regulations in national levels, and make sure it's not the private sector that's trying to fight with regulations and catch up constantly while regulations are trying to catch up with technology. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Shravishta, and for giving us a clear sense of where we stand both in the Indian context, in terms of the national security context, and beyond in terms of civil and private spaces, but also to look at some of the global examples where things have worked better than other cases, in a sense. But suddenly, when you were talking about it, also reminded me of the controversy around the India's airport facial recognition system, the Digiyatra. It has raised several concerns in the area of privacy, surveillance, exclusion, transparency, and so on and so forth. In fact, I think there have been several complaints that talked about as to how there is a certain amount of deception that has come into being, and also people are being compelled to. And most, airports, when you look at it, the airports that operate Digiyatra, you are forced into it. If you don't have a Digiyatra app, you are like forced into the last counter. You have to walk all the way, and so on and so forth, irrespective of the persons who are handling. Some of them are old people who are forced to walk a long distance, and so there are serious issues. And I think again, we can get into it. I'm sure our panelists can talk about some of these issues. But I think this is another example of an instance where how the data collection, data use can be sort of a misuse. There can be a misuse issue, and I think these are issues. Maybe some of these are teething issues. We will recover. We will move along and kind of address some of them. The other aspect, again, I think there are a lot many more issues. But let me bring in our two expert panelists. First, let me call upon our online panelist, Dr. Debayan Gupta. He's an assistant professor of computer science at Ashoka University. Debayan, over to you.
Thank you so much. I hope I'm audible. Okay, great. Thanks. That was a great talk. I think you covered a lot of very interesting points, and especially the stuff you said about the secondary collection. That's definitely something we need to put a lot of thought into. I think I have 10 minutes. So what I'll do is, I have a set of notes. I think I have 32 points, something like that. I won't get to all of them, but maybe we can discuss some of these later. But I want to bring everyone's attention to perhaps 2 or 3 very important things in the Indian context specifically, right? I think you've set the global context well enough. There's nothing else I have to say about it, majorly speaking. In the Indian context, I think one major issue is that a lot of these new solutions that we're getting in India stack, so to speak, that we have this feeling that we're a country, we're very large, we have a lot of stuff, and there's this digital magical hammer that we have, and we want to throw it at every problem, right? And that is good. We have systems like Aadhaar, UPI, which have been, if you ask most people, we use them, we like them, they are good. The problem is there's a huge lack of transparency throughout all of these services, right? And I'm not just talking about sort of some vague, a stupid person talking about transparency. I'm talking about, let's take both of these that we mentioned, Aadhaar and UPI. Aadhaar, the whole point, what was the point of biometrics in Aadhaar? It was deduplication, if you go back, right? You remember there was a scheme, JAM, Jandhan, Aadhaar, and mobile together. And the whole point of Aadhaar, of biometrics in Aadhaar was deduplication. The same person must not be able to sign up twice, right? That was the core reason. And then you had Aadhaar-enabled payment system, this, that, there were 50 other things that came in. We don't know how the government does the fingerprint deduplication. They've never published it. They've never even hinted at it. When I went and spoke to people about it, they said, oh, there's this book by someone called Jain, go read the book. That is literally the reply they give, right? You ask any computer scientist in the country or abroad, they will tell you that we don't know how to do it. Nobody seems to know how to do it except the Indian government. So how are they doing it? And they won't tell us, right? There's no hint also that there are things, vague things like, oh, machine learning. But what kind? What are you actually doing when you're deduplicating, right? There needs to be a lot of transparency there. That transparency, even though I'm not an expert, I will say also needs to apply at the finance and company level. That is, with Aadhaar, at least you have an Aadhaar Act and there's a structure there. With UPI, for example, there's a court case going on right now where people wanted to RTI details about Bhim UPI, and they couldn't because the government claims it's not a government organization. It's essentially a bank's club of some sort. And that's not the impression you and I have when we're using UPI. We think it's something like Aadhaar, it's a government thing. The same with Digiyatra. How does it make its money? Who owns it? Where is the data stored? And it's all some of these vague Section 8 companies or whatever, and it's co-owned. It's all very shady and dodgy. And, you know, we should be proud of all the technology we've developed. There's no need to go down the shady, dodgy path. Like, do it properly, and there are good reasons to use these technologies if we can be responsible about them. And that extends to the financial structure also. Among the different kinds of matching that we talked about, I do want to highlight, I think the secondary biometrics was already highlighted sufficiently. But I do want to highlight one of them in particular, which is non-secondary, which is DNA. Okay, DNA is unlike almost any other kind of biometric data. So the thing with most biometrics in general, as forms of authorization and authentication compared to, let's say, something like using a password, is that you can't take it back. If your password gets leaked, you can change your password. If your fingerprint or iris data gets leaked, you can't like replace your finger. Like that doesn't work. So you need prevention. There is no cure. You need to make sure that that data never goes out, and there are encryption methods that are there that can help with that. But those are, let's be honest, not really being used, right? It's someone, you mentioned fully homomorphic encryption. Great, I love it. I work in the area. Nobody in India uses it. No government agency, not really. So there's a lack there, but with DNA, I worry that the case is even worse. Because with DNA, I don't need your data to identify you. If I have data from one of your parents and two of your cousins, roughly speaking, I can track you down. Because it's familially integrated, right? So you don't actually need to cover the whole population. You can cover a surprisingly, depending upon how heterogeneous your population is, right? In a place like New York, it's different. In a place like, I don't know, if you're looking in a rural area in India, it's different. Depending on how heterogeneous your underlying population is, you can get DNA from a surprisingly small fraction of people and be able to identify everyone. You know, you find that someone's blood at a crime scene or someone, you can identify them without having their exact DNA, as long as you have sufficient coverage among their relatives, right? So there's some sort of spread going on there as well. in general, whenever we're talking about this stuff, it's important to compare against the alternatives, right? It's not just biometrics bad. Well, if we didn't have it, what else would we be using? And is the else option even worse? When examining that fact, it is really, really, really important to understand what a biometric actually measures, right? We often conflate biometrics with identity. Biometrics are not, my wife is not going to identify me by my fingerprint, right? What biometrics do is it is a sort of a re-verification, a technical re-verification that the person in front of you today was the same person that stood in front of you K days ago. That's it. Right? So if I lied the first time and said my name was Arpan instead of Debayan K days ago, you won't be able to catch me with that today. Right? In a country like India, as was rightly pointed out, where there's a lot of lack of documentation, people change their name spellings a lot, for example, right? There are multiple different languages, so the anglicizations of names change. You have a large fraction of the population who work with citrusy acidic fruits, for example. So pineapple farmers explicitly don't have fingerprints. I like pineapples. There's a lot of pineapple farmers in India. That acid takes off half their fingerprints. So there's a large number of farmers who can't use Aadhaar PDS at all, right? And with a country this large, these cannot be corner cases. You can't unroll the whole thing, sort of set everything up, and then discover, oh, we have a problem. It's not, oh, we have a problem. We need to think this through before. And why do we need to think this stuff through before? It's because you can't repudiate, you can't cancel. There's no way to go back, right? I'll just end with one small thing, which is the point about anonymization. Our government has started to use anonymization for a lot of different things. Surprisingly sensitive stuff. They'll just say, oh, we've anonymized it and therefore we can release it. Anonymization, proper anonymization, is really, really, really hard, right? Not too long ago, there was medical data that was released in Massachusetts, in the US, and there was a wonderful graduate student. She de-anonymized, I think, the governor of Massachusetts medical data in about 15 minutes. It's really hard to anonymize this stuff. Because if I have a combination of things from different places, like let's say I know 2 of the movies you like, I know which pin code you live in, I know, let's say, your gender, I know your level of schooling. These things by sort of piecemeal seem small, but when put together, you need surprisingly few of these to track someone down precisely, right? I can tell you right now that from personal experience, the kind of anonymization that is being done mostly in India, just sort of deleting people's names and addresses, is completely insufficient, right? And this includes very sensitive stuff like, AIDS data, for example, right? Like, it is insufficiently anonymized right now. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And as was said already, we need regulatory sort of actual rules, not just recommendations. I think I'll stop there. Most of the stuff was covered already. I just sort of brought in a couple of points and precisely 10 minutes.
Thank you, Debayan. That was perfect. No, I think you brought out some of the. I think the critical importance of the lack of transparency has been highlighted, and I think that goes across the board, whether it is in terms of the UPI or the Digi Yatra or Aadhaar and whole range of things in a sense. And like you said, we have developed certain technologies that is hugely beneficial. So why not take full credit for it, but do it in a transparent fashion? And I think I think the message is taken. Let me move to our next panelist, Meghna Bhal, who is the director of the ACS Center here in Delhi. Meghna, over to you.
Yeah. I guess I'm going to take a kind of legal realism viewpoint because I am a lawyer by training. For starters, I don't think privacy regulation is adequate in terms of addressing any of the issues that we've discussed today. One, because consent does not mean greater data protection. It's merely, it's a principle taken from from the medical fields, and it's well accepted, not only in the EU, where the GDPR kind of championed this standard of consent, but other countries as well, that consent is inadequate, doesn't really give you any sense of protecting your privacy, and it does nothing for data protection, and that is also evinced by the numerous number of data leaks that have happened in the EU, despite their kind of wavering commitment, or so they say, to consent. The other thing is that in the context of India specifically, when we consider privacy regulation, we have to consider that there are exemptions under our privacy law, particularly for state instrumentalities. And I think to the Bayan's point, where he was talking about, both Digiyatra as well as NPCI, where currently they are not presented as state instrumentalities, would they be exempted from different provisions within the DPDPA under this law? And I think that's something we're all anticipating and waiting to see. And of course, the wider exemptions, not only in India but globally as well, for state instruments, particularly law enforcement agencies, where I think there is the greatest concern of misuse of this kind of data. I have a slight problem with um, the kind of classification of behavioral data as biometric data, and my only problem there, and I guess here I'm now coming from an economic standpoint, is that the more compliances you create around data, the more expensive you make it, without necessarily creating an adequate scheme of protection for it. And that we've seen with the GDPR. So all you're doing is entrenching the position of incumbents who have the means and finances to meet those compliances, and you're creating entry barriers for smaller startups. There's multiple empirical studies from the EU that have shown the various market failures created in this regard by the GDPR. And now, of course, if you look at the Digital Competition Bill, as well as its European predecessor, Digital Markets Act, there is some regulation of the usage of behavioral, um, well, not behavioral data, but yeah, essentially the usage of data, that the cross usage of data, as well as the combination of data across different platforms, which invariably puts a restriction on the usage of behavioral data. And that is, the problems with that also kind of translate for the consumer. Like, we've done a study on the consumer welfare implications of data usage restrictions under the Digital Competition Bill. And I know it's sounding kind of tangential, but since we are kind of extending the definition of biometrics to behavioral data, and even going as far as claiming it to be bioinformatics, which I think then conflicts with IP considerations around the analysis and creation of data sets that are basically derived from behavioral data, which would, that IP would belong to the company that has created those databases. Yeah, so from a welfare standpoint, particularly in India, most consumers that we surveyed, and we surveyed 2,000 of them, find targeting helpful. It decreases their search costs. And only, I think, about 2% or maybe 5% of the consumers we surveyed didn't find it helpful. So I think that's something to consider, when we are kind of waving the flag for privacy or decrease in the usage of data, to understand what we are actually advocating for. It is necessarily elitist argument, whereas also I agree that it is used, that going back now to biometric data, that it is used as a point of exclusion. And to Devan's point again, I think we saw the problem of state instrumentalities centering their programs around the collection or the usage of this data, particularly when there's a significant burden placed on their system. So during the COVID, when COVID came in, and we had the lockdown, there was a really, really high failure rate on AEPS, because they had never anticipated that kind of volume on their system. And that is not only a function of biometrics; it's a function of poor planning and design, which you know, the state is guilty of across the board, not only in the context of biometrics. But coming back to the larger point, I think there needs to be greater emphasis on the problems with the state usage and yes, transparency, etc., etc. And again, like to reiterate my point, I don't think privacy law is going to do anything because one, the state is exempt. Two, it's just used as a means of access, so consent basically waives, and it doesn't matter how many waves of consent you add. In fact, I would say it's more exclusionary and elitist because there are a number of people who aren't digitally literate, who are quality of service is not equivalent. I would say quality of service is not consistent throughout the country. So you're trying to load a page and there's like multiple consent things popping up at you, and it's just adding friction. And then maybe it's a time bound transaction and you lose the transaction and you have to start again. It's really, really painful and problematic. So I don't think adding multiple consent layers does anything, except kind of like I see it as hand waving. And yeah, and like I said, it creates an entry barrier for smaller companies and only seeks to serve incumbents who are entrenched as it is. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Meghna, for sort of detailing many of the problem areas. And I don't know if we have a solution in place and how we kind of. But one point I just wanted to get back, and I want everybody to be sort of a participatory in kind of thing. So we'll open it up for Q&A. But just one question I had for all the three panelists is also in terms of looking at the role of the private sector, because the private sector is going to play a bigger role in the coming years, especially when you talk about new technologies or new technologies interfacing with some of the more traditional domains and kind of things. So you have an issue of accountability and kind of things, but at the same time, in some cases, some of the technologies, when you look at it, private sector has also taken a lead role in setting standards, in providing for the best practices and so on and so forth. So is there a way of bringing in the private sector as a sort of as a credible stakeholder and giving them the space to kind of develop something? And is there a model that can work and kind of things? I'm curious to kind of see if that is something that is going to work around these issues of data and data collection, data usage, biometric data usage and collection, and so on and so forth. Meghna, maybe I'll start off with you.
Yeah. Just one thing on the private sector. I feel like, I mean, I guess some leaks notwithstanding, there is a reputational consideration, particularly for large companies. So there is an inherent incentive to guard data.
Yeah, right.
There's also a commercial incentive to guard it.
Right.
And so from that standpoint, and I mean, we're seeing now a more apparent commercial incentive play out where people are like basically trying to block, AI companies from scraping their data. So I think that needs to be considered as well when we try to overemphasize the role of the private sector. I agree with you that them setting standards might be a way, but again, you have to consider their incentives. Typically, they opt for standardization in areas where they want interoperability or they want market entry. And so in this context, yeah, I think it would be, from a business standpoint, probably beneficial for them if there was like an international standard. And I don't know if the ISO has already done work on this. It seems like it would have. It's likely that it would have. That's something I would check. But I would say that, yeah, I mean, there is an incentive to do it for the private sector because it eases their kind of compliance across the board. But then I don't know if the PAN has something to say about maybe the security implications of standardization, if that creates some kind of attack vector or not.
Yeah, I agree by and large. And I think the clear sort of a motivation for them is because they are putting in money. So in a sense, there's a financial stake for them to sort of get things right, have a standard and so on and so forth. But Debayan, go ahead.
Sure. So look, security-wise, yes, there's always a danger in the sense that, and the Indian government, you've seen this come up in this story about data localization and so on. All of these companies are based basically in the US, a bunch in China, a few in Europe, right? that creates a certain kind of worry. I'm not going to discuss that because that's a 1 hour discussion on its own. But there are sort of geopolitical, vague, not well described worries that come up, especially since once those people, shall we say, have the data, the capacity building around that also happens there. So there's this sort of long term pipeline of worries. There's also the fact that, yes, there are certain kinds of security issues that can come up in terms of storing the data, because very frankly, a lot of the laws in these countries, if you look at the sort of regulations, I should say, things like the US FISA court have put forward regarding non-American data usage. It's basically, if it's data of US citizens, be very careful. If it's anyone else's, we don't care at all. So the kinds of protections there are very vague. So there's a certain amount of worry about that. But going back, this we were talking about in the context specifically of the private sector. So my FISA court story is a little bit of a lie. My worry with the private sector one, I agree it's probably good enough. But my worry with the private sector one is that the private sector does not have a sort of, they have certain fiduciary duties, right? We want to make profits for our shareholders, and you're banking on those incentives to get them to make good rules about this stuff. A private sector entity has no reason to take care of young teenagers in India, for example, right? The government, on the other hand, does. The Indian government has a requirement that it needs to make sure that whatever regulation it creates takes care of every last citizen. If they're not, they are violating the oaths that they took very recently. So a company, we need to be very careful. I think, I'm obviously sort of hopping on the negative side a little bit. I do think that companies can be trusted and will come up with good regulations for most of this stuff. But we do need to have the government involved to set some minimum protective standards. Because with all of this, and we've seen this happen again and again and again, there are always these marginalized, tiny, what we call corner case populations come in. In a country the size of India, a corner case population is 1 million, 2 million, 10 million. And that's we can't allow that to happen. That's the only worry, really.
Yeah, it throws up some interesting further thoughts on it, because the governments are expected to do certain things. And on the other hand, private sector is, money making is not a bad thing. If you don't make money, they are not running a charity business. So if you're not making money at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to provide for any sort of a CSR or other things, and a lot of that. But anyway, there's a lot of further thoughts and questions on that. But I think that's something still we can debate on it. Shavishta, you had some thoughts on it?
Yeah, sure. I mostly, echo the thoughts that Meghna and Devayan had made. One thing that I did want to bring up, which I feel sort of covers a lot of the points that were brought up just now, was the DNA sample example that Devayan gave. I also have a paper on biosafety labs, and the regulations in that area are very interesting because they cover exactly what was being discussed in all 3 points. They talk about how DNA sample data needs to be protected, especially if it's submitted to a biosafety lab, whether private or public, how there needs to be benefit sharing. So, in terms of IP, that is also covered, even though this is DNA sample data and it's not considered biometric data. And it is a space where the government and private sector regulations and policies tend to agree when it comes to how this data is used. The reason I bring this up is because while we're talking about biometric data, I feel like it's very easy to go back to the DPDPA and think about the criticisms over there and implement that over here. But there are other legacy regulations that we can look at and gain inspiration from. And I feel like the biosafety regulations, while also need improvement, are still a better space to gain some inspiration from in this area as well. In terms of private sector involvement, the same thing of what was being said about deduplication. Every single time you ask them what they're doing, they say black box model. How applicable it is, how useful it is, and how much they actually do it would be in question. And I would in fact bring up the concept of consent over here and what you said about consent being mostly hand waving. While I agree that consent is not enough, I do think it's necessary simply for it doesn't, but it holds companies accountable, which is what you said later. And it's still a minimum requirement in my opinion. I mean, we can disagree on this, but in my opinion, I think that expecting companies, even if not governments, to ask for explicit consent holds them accountable to a certain level of data collection and to at least ensure that they give one disclaimer, which is not, like you said, not enough. But I do think it is the first step forward, and it's not something we should lose out on, even if it increases barrier to entry for other organizations. Because, like Devayan just mentioned, even small organizations accessing small levels of population in a country like India is still a very, very large number. And in considerations of national security, a small number is still very significant. So, I mean, yeah, this is a very interesting and vast space, and there will always be points of disagreement. But I thought this was a very interesting point that you brought up, which is why I wanted to mention mine.
Thank you so much for the panel discussion, and it was quite enlightening. So I'm Shirin, by the way, and I was an entrepreneur. So the thing is, as I heard you all, I found that laws are quite shaky, inconsistent, and quite authoritative, in a sense, like we are forced to comply with certain, like we have to be with digi app and all the things like. So in that scenario, like what kind of rights or what kind of things we can have, not if we are not complying with these things, and what provisions or what rights we are having in that scenario if we do not comply. Because if we do not comply, we are certainly thrown out of the system. And then do we have some rights in that scenario? Thank you.
Individuals' rights?
Yeah.
Like you as a citizen, what rights do you have?
Yes, as a citizen.
So under the DPDPA, most of the compliances require, if you're not complying, it's mostly a fine. There's not too much an individual can do. The individual also does not have the right to be forgotten. You can only change your information, but that if you're not changing it, it still has to be there. I mean, these are major criticisms of the DPDPA, and the rules are still upcoming. So if you're talking about how an individual can represent themselves, maybe the lawyer can answer that question better, because for me, it's a policy level analysis. But I would say that it's not the best regulation when it comes to individual level protection. It's more a standard for dissuading companies.
It's a bit quite authoritative thing. Like we have to comply. We have no choice.
Yes,
And
but
it certainly devalue us as a human, and as a personal as in my personal space, it intrudes.
absolutely. I mean, that was true before the DPDPA as well. While the DPDPA is a regulation that we needed, let's hope the rules also address a lot of these problems. But yeah, Meghna will.
Yeah, I mean, your interaction with the online space or with any media space, if I can call it that, is inherently subsidized by advertisements, right? And
Course.
you give your data in exchange for that. The converse of that, the flip, or if you don't want to give your data, you can't have those services for free.
Of course.
And people can disagree with me about the ethics of that, but at the end of the day, a service is being provided. It's the same principle that's deployed by newspapers, by broadcasters across the board. It's just that their targeting is not as effective as digital platforms.
So as an individual, I do not use those of the social networking sites and all the things. So I'm saved there. But if I'm going airport and I'm using other services, then I'm forced to use these things.
That is a state instrumentality, and I agree
Yes.
it's a problem. And
That's a
actually, even
problem.
the Digiyatra, I mean, yes, that weird kind of coercion that they do, where they send you to the side, and
Exactly.
but forget about that. I mean, if you have some wherewithal, you know how to. And even when you reach the airport and there's someone who's basically saying that all departures go to the Digiyatra gate, where they're trying to trick you into going to their gates. But if you go to certain airports in India, like the Ahmedabad airport, you have to give your facial biometrics. You have no choice when you're entering security. So, I mean, again, like I said, there seems to be an overemphasis on private collection of technology, but that is covered to some extent. What we really have to consider is the state state collection of data. Sorry, not technology. State collection of data, where there is this coercion and there's no way for you to opt out, and there's not even. I mean, I don't think the state can argue that, oh, this is transactional, we're providing you a service and therefore we want your data in exchange, because that is not their incentive, or, that is not something that, can be justified by the state, essentially.
Actually, it quite intrigues me, like that much of data with 1.4 billion population, what a state is going to do with it, basically.
Yeah,
I mean, a state cannot sell it to companies or all the things. So how, is not an overburden on the
Yeah,
technology.
we're going to have this extended
Yeah,
discussion over the coffee there. Let me get some of the others in the room. Okay. If you can identify yourself, please.
Good evening. Thanks for a very good presentation, informative also in that sense. My name is Pavan. My question is pertaining to the question which she asked and the reply, in fact, which Madam gave. In the past, there was a decision of the Supreme Court saying that which all places the biometric data, that is Aadhaar, can be compulsory. In some places, it was discretionary. The experience, in fact, which in fact consumers or in fact general citizens they have is that wherever there is a compulsory, there is no problem for the security agencies or for your financial intelligence. All the integration has to be done. That is automatically done. Government doesn't take your authorization. They have got the right to do it. Now coming to the services, like some additional services in banks, private banks specifically. Say for example, somebody wants to take a loan from private partner or private agency. There they, in fact, what they do, they emphasize on the collection of your Aadhaar card and biometric data. Now, what rights, in fact, the person is having in those cases? I'll give an example of your EPF. I was in fact, nodal officer for one of the
Which
organizations.
institution are you from? Where are you from, in a sense?
I work for a government organization. I'm on deputation, Central Staffing Scheme.
Okay.
So I was the nodal officer of one of the organizations where EPFO made it compulsory that those people who are going to get the EPF number, even if in fact there is no need for in fact giving the data of the in fact concerned officials, they said that unless until you give the data, we are not going to give you the EPF number. So this is the kind of problem which is there, and it is not in the mandatory list. It was not. It's not discretionary list. When in fact I wrote to the highest officials also, they were in fact saying that everybody is giving, you also give. So that is a question in fact which a common person see. For example, state can do whatever from the security point of view. They will give n number of in fact reasons why they want to do it. But when it comes to where in fact there is a discretion in this thing, you know the kind of harassment which a person, if you're taking a small loan of 25,000. Gets from these people, private players. Somebody was saying that private player is going to, in fact, for the services. But what they do and the kind of data this goes from here to the enemy countries, or in fact, which are not in fact having good relations with, say for example, Chinese companies. They have this data. Tomorrow, how they are using this data, what they do it, it's in fact big question. And there is no policy level, in fact, even discussions, forget about any enactment or in fact any this thing which is coming up. Sad state of affairs. Thank you.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I have a very interesting example of the problem with the way the Provident Fund operates, where often people's names are noted down wrong, and then they can't pull their money out because, or they've changed their names, etc. But mostly it's the name has been noted down completely wrong, and not even a typo. It's like a completely different name. And yes, there have been, these problems that you're talking about where basically someone is being extorted because there might be some discrepancy in their Aadhaar information, or it might not be matching, etc. This happens in ration shops as well. It's like a well-known criticism of Aadhaar that it is used to exploit and exploit people on the ground. And I absolutely agree with you. But the problem is, if you criticize anything in the India stack, whether it be Aadhaar, whether it be UPI, no one wants to listen to you. It's not even that no one wants to listen to you. You get shouted down in any government meeting that you go for. I went for instance, I was in a meeting where I spoke critically of the UPI in a specific context. And I was yelled at, saying that, how dare you say this? How dare you say this? This is a national pride, etc., etc. So I think the problem there is this: when the state sees sees technological interventions made by it as extensions of itself, and it is kind of intertwined with its political identity. I think that is where the problem really emanates from. I know that's not a solution. The solution, of course, is that we demand more. I mean, well, I guess the only solution really is litigation, or you protest, or you write to your ministers. But like you said, that no one wants to listen to you, and it's because that there is the political identity is so heavily intertwined with the technological intervention.
Sure.
Thing which in fact which is quite, in fact, people, there are many instances. There is a duplication of the, in fact, same person having 3-4 Aadhaar cards.
Yeah. That's
How
right.
it is happening? Because there is a systematic issue is there. Systematic in the forms of, say, for example, same person having the Aries, how they do it,
Exactly.
what level, the kind of data, in fact, the sensitivity of data which is collected by the outsourced agencies,
That's right.
the person who is collecting data.
Even the manner in which Aadhaar cards were first given, whether it would be a common service center or even if you were registered for one, very often, and I can give my example again, my Aadhaar card was secured from an agency that had lost its license, but they were still giving out Aadhaar cards, and I had 2 pictures for my Aadhaar card. So the first one that came, I had a certain picture, and then they said, "Oh no, it's not valid. You have to take a picture again." And then I had to go back and take my picture. Then that same picture came back, and then when I had got my Aadhaar card and printed, another picture came out. So yeah, it's pretty murky. And
Another example,
yeah.
in fact, which is there, Nadra is in fact a kind of a agency which is there in Pakistan. They have got a system where, in fact, it's very difficult to, in fact, manipulate the data there, because the moment they see, they will know from which area you are in. It's coded in such a way.
Yeah.
If you are from, say, for example, Pakistan, they will come to know. Whether you are male or female, they will come to know. Immediately, they see the number. That kind of, in fact, thought process not into the Aadhaar, in fact, biometrics.
Again, all of this have their own pluses and minuses, but again, yeah, the need for more stringent kind of ways to kind of deal with it. And of course, I think it also takes you back to the whole transparency question. And again, the issue of states' identity intertwined with these developments. Again, that's something that is further complicating the issue. You had a question? Yeah, I'll come
One
back.
interesting thing about Aadhaar is the origins of Aadhaar, right? Who suggested it? It was someone from the private sector at the end of the day who had an incentive to have people on,
Yeah.
have data on billions of individuals. And then you think about it from a private sector perspective, who pushes for digital identity for everyone again. So yeah, I mean, I think there's been a conflation of private sector incentive with, I would say, more a political incentive, and it has kind of translated into all these problems today, because again, poor planning and design is very much a hallmark of Indian governance.
Yeah.
I would like
Again,
to
identify yourself and the
Yes, sorry.
institution.
I'm Steve, a student yet. So there is International Consortium of Journalists. Before few years, they revealed this data about Chinese company Zenhua Data Informatics Center, which collects data about citizens from different nations. And Edward Snowden revealed how US does it. And this is an era of Cold War. Every data is like new uranium. And every country wants to ensure its national security. Okay. Secondly, MNCs, the bigger MNCs, Meta, Alphabet, which are the mega collector of data, even they are today operating cross-border. But all we have been seeing right now, discussing right now, till now is the national regulation. Don't we think we should focus rather on the international regulations, because this issue is cross-border? Don't we think? Don't you think like we need something on the lines of atomic regulations? Like the nuclear proliferation treaty we had something on that lines we need to focus on this issue.
I agree with you on the need for regulations, but even at the global level. But I would not go along with the atomic energy regulations or nuclear set of regulations, because nuclear, given the kind of disastrous consequence of the use of nuclear weapons or nuclear material, it is highly restrictive. But data is going to be used across for a lot of the beneficial, it has a lot of positive benefits in a sense, and therefore I would look at it as a more other dual use kind of thing. So things that are being greatly used in the civil sector, but something that also has military or security implications in a sense. So whether it is chemical materials or biological materials and kind of thing, how they are being used, how they are being regulated is where I would kind of look at it. But otherwise, yeah, over to you.
So I agree with Dr. Raji. Maybe conflating it to the level of nuclear tech is not the right way to go. I would not say even with bioweapons and chemical weapons, because that gets dangerously close to how data localization works. You're basically restricting trade, right? You're restricting movement of certain dangerous materials. And data, while it is very fundamentally important for national security, is also very fundamentally important for economy. And it is not possible to function in local, I mean, we as Indians cannot function with localized data. You use Google and Facebook every single day. Even if people are not on social media, you're using email every single day, and that you're scrolling through apps every single day when you're going through Google or you're Googling something. That is still collection of data. And a lot of this is going to contribute to how you're accessing the world. Limiting data transfer and cross-border transfers it's also going to limit your DPIs. It's also going to limit your digital public infrastructure, which is something that India prides itself in. So how are you going to ask for limitations on global cross trade, but also function as an economy that prides itself on DPIs? What I think you're trying to indicate is that we need global regulations, which is the reason I wrote this paper, because it does talk about ethical considerations, not regulations. And at a global level, all you can do is consider something that is the baseline for all nations, right? Which should be ethics. And that is why I mentioned Interpol, because they have biometric data. They have a project called First Project, which discusses biometric data. That's why I brought up ISO, which is a standards organization for private sectors but functions globally. So while I don't necessarily see biometric data or any data being governed globally, because that will restrict flow of data, I do agree that there should be some level of global oversight.
There is somewhat patchwork of frameworks that govern this globally. And concept was, I guess, most clearly crystallized in the Osaka track of the G20. It's known as data free flows with trust. And it basically talks about data protection framework interoperability. So in the GDPR, you have these things known as adequacy agreements, where you also have some other instruments, but you have adequacy agreements where the EU okays the transfer of the data of EU citizens to another country, provided that their frameworks are adequate in the eyes of the EU. What this means is that there's an independent supervisory authority. They also consider, the adherence of that country's framework to EU data protection principles. And there's one more consideration. India is doing it a bit differently. We basically have a negative list that we will come out with whenever the rules come out. Whereas there are certain countries, it doesn't matter what your level of data protection is. We just won't send it to countries that are not our friends. We won't permit the kind of export of our data, of our citizens' data, to which are not our friends. And then you have things that like the EU-US Privacy Shield, which was shot down by the European Court of Justice. And so they've come out with a new one where basically it's an agreement between the EU and the US that, there will be certain restrictions placed on law enforcement access to data and certain safeguards that are accrued. No, it's not the Cloud Act. Accrued to Cloud Act is about data sharing for law enforcement authorities. This is a privacy agreement between the EU and the US, and certain protections will be provided and safeguards will be provided for the data of EU citizens in the US that is transferred to the US.
Sorry, Debayan, did you want to respond to any of the questions?
No, I think mostly things have been covered. I'll just say that I think the only point that was in the original presentation, once the function creep stuff, that is worth just mentioning one more time that, when we're talking about a lot of these protections, again, just bringing it back to biometrics specifically, the worry is that it's threefold. First, why do we assume, we should not assume that our software engineers in the government are any better than the civil engineers. So when you hear 10 bridges fell down in Bihar, assume the same level of adequacy in your software engineers. Point number one. Okay. Don't assume these are suddenly randomly clever people. Number two, political interests will always go for what is easy. Yeah. This means that Singapore, after collecting all sorts of biometric data during COVID, promising it would never use it for anything else, promptly after COVID said, no, we'll use it for criminal prosecutions, right? India, fortunately, there are some pretty, I'm not a legal person, but the Aadhaar Act prevents a lot of different kinds of things of this sort from happening. But we shouldn't take that for granted, right? We need to be more careful about that. I think the issue is that with ongoing function creep, there's always, people collect data for one purpose, they're going to use it for another. And tomorrow you're going to discover a third purpose for the kinds of use of that data, right? So you thought you were giving your iris scans because of to DigiYatra, which is a private company made up of, I think, 6 of the airports. It's organized by the Civil Aviation Ministry, but it's this group. You give them your iris scans, and you think it's for entry into this. Now, it turns out 2 years after that, Microsoft discovers that, oh, I can use your iris scans to guess your heart health. And they then sell this data to an insurance company, and then 5 days later, you figure out your insurance premium has gone up. Okay. So, like, there are very, very weird things that can happen. You think you're giving up, that's why I think, there was this idea that was brought up, it went back and forth a bit. Consent is not sufficient, although it may be necessary. It is not sufficient because you don't know what you're consenting to. How can you possibly know? Especially with things like gait analysis and iris, fingerprints, not so much, at least from what I'm aware. There are all sorts of health data that you're giving away, right? Your cardiovascular health especially, you can guess a lot. And there's more coming up, right? So how can you possibly consent if you don't know what you're consenting to? With the iris data that, let's say, DigiYatra Foundation currently has, you can guess all sorts of things about people's health, right? Is that okay? Is DigiYatra allowed to resell that data to pharmaceutical companies? Right now they are. There's nothing preventing them from doing it. Completely legal, right? So, I mean, there needs to be a lot more on there. And with regard to global regulation, look, that's great. We haven't figured out the goalpost for our local regulation only, right? Imagine you go to the global regulation, United Nations sits down and says, Namaste, whatever you say, we will do. Tell us. What will you tell them? We don't know. We need to write it down first, make sure it works, and then we can talk global, right? Like, global is important, but like, we haven't figured out what we want yet. At least I haven't. I shouldn't speak for others.
No, the cohesive, I agree, absolutely. I think that's something that's come around multiple times, that consent, the issue of consent. Giving consent, again, when it comes along with the cohesive element, especially when it comes to DigiYatra, how there has been, people have been coerced at the airport to, download the app and so on and so forth, whether they want to or not. I think those are issues. How do you deal with that is still an open-ended question. Amoha, over to you.
Picking up on the strands of economic development and demand, we're currently working on the second edition of the Young India Tech Survey, which measures the trade-offs that the youth of the country is willing to make between privacy, economic development, and national security. And the one trend we found across the board is that, irrespective of gender, region, age, employment, education, privacy is the least priority. So the youth is happy to sacrifice privacy for the sake of what they think is either economic development or national security. So that, I think, adds another layer of tension to the regulatory environment, because in the absence of demand from the public, in the absence of will from the government, in the absence of any kind of interest from the private sector, how do we push and to what extent can we push for the kind of regulation we really need in the country?
I think what you just mentioned pulls at Meghna's point a lot, right? What she said about accessing advertisements, it's either advertisements or subscription. So I don't think people are sacrificing privacy because they are willing to sacrifice privacy. It's mostly because they're getting a service in return, and they'd rather sacrifice information that is already being collected rather than have to additionally pay for a service that they didn't have to originally pay for. To push for regulations that can encourage privacy, again, do you want the privacy before you want to regulate it? I'm all for regulation. I wrote an entire paper on it. But overregulation is also an issue, and like Meghna had also mentioned, it does create barriers to entry. Whether the reason I'm not opposed to barriers of entry is because biometric information is extremely sensitive data and has implications beyond just submitting static data, right? As Debayan just mentioned, you can also extract health data. Something as fundamental as sharing health data with school teachers. Like, if a child has AIDS, do you really want that information to be shared with your entire school, your peers, other hospitals you go to? It is a matter of privacy, right? Over there, yes, you might need regulations to protect that information. But at what level do you stop regulating? So I think when you're talking about people being willing to submit information for national security or economic growth, the takeaway from that is that they are willing to submit it for national security as they assume to be protected, and economic growth as they see economy growing. Maybe the regulation should be, do you want privacy to protect yourself in case there is no economic growth? Are people submitting this data for a lack of result as well? That's where the regulation conversation might come in.
Meghna, you want to add?
Untenable regulatory position, speaking as a lawyer and someone who's worked with regulation. I think what we've all been saying is that the problem is, yes, there is a problem with the private sector, particularly when you're dealing with finance, which is a heavily regulated space. But I think the larger problem, of course, is the fact that, and this is kind of what I was driving at, is that you have a state that has no incentive to regulate its own activities and has the capability to exempt itself from it completely. So from that standpoint, I understand that some regulation is necessary and we're moving towards that. But I've experienced what it's like to have an overly powerful regulator in a certain sector. And in India, they're very prone to regulatory capture. So regulatory capture doesn't necessarily mean public welfare or public interest. It means private interest and arbitrary regulation. And this is just a larger point about regulation and how it plays out in this country. And we're seeing that even play out in the DPDPA, right, where you basically have consent managers who are classified as data processors under the Act and are not beholden to any of the provisions. And they are not, they're not considered data fiduciaries. They have no fiduciary responsibility over your data, even though they're handling all of it, which is a weird kind of exemption in my mind. And of course, there's an incentive problem there as well, whereas no consumer, even though they're supposed to be beholden to consumers, because they're supposed to be serving the consumer's interest, no consumer is going to pay a consent manager at the end of the day, right? So their business model is completely dependent on data fiduciaries. So who are they really going to serve? And this is why I keep harping on about planning and design, because I think that if we do bring out regulation, then all these kinds of consequences have to be gamed out, which they rarely are.
Good afternoon. I'm Noel. I'm a lawyer and Schwartzman scholar and the founder of Himalayan Dark. I think my question was to Debayan. I think you mentioned that both UPI and DigiYatra are private companies. But I think I would argue that under the functions they do are sovereign, and under Article 12, they could be argued to be a state, and therefore a part of the government. even though they are privately registered entities. And speaking of the state, I think it could be also argued that um, our entire focus has been largely on creating safeguards against the government. But if you look at the philosophy and the idea of privacy, the privacy is is a misuse of your personal data rather than the collection of your personal data. And therefore, it could be argued that we should adopt a public trust doctrine with regards to privacy, as we have done with a lot of other things. We have adopted a private trust doctrine with regards to safety, security, social contract with the state. We adopted it with respect to the environment. So why not with privacy? We complain a lot about the government taking away our data, but we complain even more about the government not giving us services. So I would argue that if we can adopt a public trust doctrine towards privacy, and if you read the UIDA Act, the Aadhaar Act, Section 33 read with Section 29 also embodies a public trust doctrine within it, which allows the state to make certain exceptions for your private data. Just wanted to know your ideas about creating a public trust approach towards data privacy in India. Something similar to that you find in Singapore and China. Thank you.
Debayan, go ahead.
So, sure, two answers about it, I guess. So first, I completely agree with you that these UPI and DigiYatra should be public instruments, right? The government disagrees with you. There are court cases going on exactly that topic. They feel like public companies, they act like public companies, they smell like public companies. The government insists that they are not, and therefore they are exempt from RTI, right? That's the whole shindig there. So there's a lot of arguments there, but I completely agree with you. They should be public. With regard to the second point that you make, that the difference between collection and misuse, I'm very American when it comes to that. I do not trust the government at all. It's not the government's job to be my father. All right. The government should be I'm very Benjamin Franklin about that. I don't see any reason why the government should be collecting my data. As a matter of fact, that's what the NSA chief said when he was brought in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee after the PRISM program. And he revealed that the US government had been recording the phone calls of roughly 80% of the population that they were covering in those countries. That's most of the world. And they were doing nothing with it. They were doing absolutely jack with that data because they didn't even have the power to process it. And he was told that they didn't care about non-American citizens, but they said, wait, you're collecting pretty much all phone calls of American citizens and keeping them for roughly a month? He's like, yes. But you're collecting that data. And he said, no. Collecting isn't when I put it in a library. Collecting is when a human being hears that call or reads it. So they redefined the word collection to make that legal, roughly speaking. I do not believe the government has a right to collect my data in the first place, right? It needs to justify that. Now, when I'm moving around at public gate data, behavioral data, I agree with what one of the other panelists said, that can lead to a lot of other economic problems. But especially with my fingerprint, it's not the nothing. I don't have the nothing to hide philosophy. I have lots to hide. I want to hide every aspect of my life, right? For a more proper legal treatment of that pattern of thought, I would follow Daniel Solov, digital person. He's got a book called Nothing to Hide, for example. So he provides a full legal background on this, but I will say I have plenty to hide. It's just not illegal, right? I don't want the government to know what I've been doing, where I've been going, what transportation I've been taking. It's none of their business, right? So my point is that my life should be completely and absolutely private, except for the tiny, tiny fraction that the government makes open to itself for certain pre-stated reasons under pre-stated assumptions. And I choose to follow those assumptions because I choose to live in India. If I don't like it, I should move to a different country. It's that simple. But saying that, oh, the government, there should be public trust, everyone, I don't have public trust in the government. They can barely function, right? Like my MP was caught taking money a few years ago. I don't trust her. Like these are absolutely trash people. What are we talking about? Why should we trust them? So I don't agree with the public trust storyline at all.
Hey, very valid point, and I think this, and it also brings to the time in a sense. We have actually finished about 1.5 hours. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I'm not trying to summarize the discussion. It's been fairly rich and very, very extensive in a sense. But I want to thank everyone for coming in today, because despite the rains, quite a few made it to the the discussion today, and that's like that says a lot about the importance of the subject. And I think this is an issue that will continue, because we haven't found any solutions really. So we are going to continue this particular debate, and I hope to see you, the Bayan, in person for the next meeting that we might have. Thank you so much for joining us online, and Meghna, thank you so much for coming in today, and Shravishta for writing us the report, this report, and bringing us all together. And thank you all for joining us. And we have the report online, so please do go there and check out the report. Hopefully, it's interesting and useful in your academic / policy writings and so on and so forth. Those of you who are in the room, please join us for a cup of coffee in the next room. Thank you so much.